Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
I'm really excited for the deep dive today.
Same here, because we're getting into something pretty intense. I want you, the listener, to just imagine for a second that your entire world has literally burned to the ground.
Like everything you know.
Yeah, exactly. Your government, your spiritual center, your whole cultural identity, the actual architecture of your daily life is it's gone.
And not just gone, but violently taken from you.
Right. Your leaders are gone, your community is scattered, and honestly, the absolute worst part, the people who burned it all down, the oppressors, they're getting unbelievably rich off the ashes.
It was just the ultimate slap in the face.
It really is. So you have to ask, where is God in that math? How do you even wake up the next morning and try to construct some sort of meaning for your life when the universe has just, violently rewarded the wicked and crushed the faithful?
It's the most agonizing question a human can ask.
Absolutely. And back in the year 100 AD, someone actually tried to answer that exact question. They wrote what is basically a survival manual for the human soul.
But they had to write it in a kind of historical code just to survive.
Which is fascinating. So today, we are opening the pages of 2 Esdras, specifically the first 10 chapters.
Yeah, and to give a little bit of structural background right away, just so we are all on the same page, this is an apocryphal book.
Right, which means what exactly for people who might not know?
Well, the Apocrypha, which literally translates to hidden things, refers to a collection of ancient texts that fall into this intertestamental period.
Like the gap between the Old and New Testaments?
Exactly. Roughly between the events of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, or just shortly after. They didn't make the final official cut of the Hebrew canonical scriptures or the standard Protestant Bible.
Though I know they are included in Catholic and Orthodox traditions, right?
Right, they are. But the key here is that their exclusion from certain canons doesn't diminish their historical or, their psychological power at all.
Honestly, the fact that it's somewhat hidden makes it feel even more urgent to me.
Oh, absolutely.
And we aren't here today to just do some dry academic autopsy of a dead scroll. We want to look at this purely as a profound human artifact.
We're basically acting as guides through this really intense visionary work.
Yeah, trying to extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and how you can actually apply this to your life today.
Because the questions 2 Esdras wrestles with are just unavoidable human questions. Why do good people suffer? Why does the world feel so fundamentally broken?
And how do we find hope when our personal reality has completely collapsed?
So to even begin to answer those questions, we have to look at the crater left by the explosion that created this text.
We have to understand the trauma.
Right. And the fascinating thing about 2 Esdras is that it's a text born not just out of one trauma, but 2 superimposed traumas.
Separated by, 600 years?
600 years, yeah. The text itself actually opens with a very specific setting. The author claims he is in Babylon, in the 30th year after the ruin of the city.
And he introduces himself as Salathiel, who is also called Ezra.
Exactly. So on a literal reading, the text is telling you, hey, it is 556 BC. I'm sitting here in Babylon, 30 years after the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar came in, sieged Jerusalem, and destroyed the first temple.
Right, the 586 BC destruction. That's the surface level claim.
Yeah, the surface claim. But when historians and biblical scholars really dig into the language, the theology, and the historical markers hidden in the text, a completely different reality emerges.
This is the crazy part.
It really is. This isn't a diary entry from 556 BC. It's a literary device known as typology.
Meaning the core of this book was actually written around 100 AD.
Yes, 100 AD.
Wait, so the author isn't writing about the Babylonians at all?
Not at all. He's writing 30 years after a completely different but equally devastating event. The destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple by the Roman Empire.
Specifically, the siege led by Titus in 70 AD.
Exactly. The author is using the ancient Babylonian destruction as a mask, like a historical code for the devastating Roman destruction he just lived through.
Man, we really have to pause here to grasp the psychological weight of that.
The absolute horror of 70 AD for the Jewish community in the first century cannot be overstated.
Because it wasn't just losing a war, right? It wasn't just, a change in political administration.
No, the temple in Jerusalem wasn't just a building to them. It was the literal geographic center of their cosmos.
It was where heaven and earth intersected.
Exactly. It housed the genealogical records, the national archives, the whole sacrificial system that maintained cosmic order and human atonement.
So when the Romans burned it down, from their perspective, the universe objectively collapsed.
Completely. And the starvation during the siege was so severe. I mean, contemporary historians like Josephus record unspeakable horrors.
Yeah, tens of thousands were crucified, enslaved, or thrown to the beasts in Roman arenas.
And you can actually still see the Arch of Titus in Rome today, which was built to celebrate this exact slaughter. It literally depicts Roman soldiers carrying away the sacred menorah.
Wow. Okay, so that context completely changes the tone of the book.
It does.
Because the problem of theodicy, which, for the listener, is just the fancy theological term for, if God is good, why is there evil? That isn't some abstract philosophical debate for this author.
Right. They aren't debating this over wine in a comfortable academy.
No, it is a bleeding, gaping wound. He is walking through a world that literally smells like smoke and death.
Exactly.
But here is what confuses me a bit. If you are hurting that badly in 100 AD, why hide behind a pseudonym?
That's a great question.
Because if my city was just burned to the ground, I want to scream about Rome, I want to name names, you know. Why pretend to be a guy who lived 600 years ago? Doesn't that sort of blunt the emotional impact?
It might seem that way to a modern reader. We really value raw, unfiltered autobiographical journaling today.
Yeah, we want the live stream of the trauma.
Right. But in antiquity, particularly in the genre of apocalyptic literature, adopting the persona of an ancient hero like Ezra wasn't seen as forgery or cowardice.
It was just a genre convention.
A highly sophisticated one, yeah. Think of it as a psychological safety net.
A safety net? How so?
Well, by speaking through the character of Ezra, a revered historical figure who famously helped rebuild the community after the first destruction, the author is implicitly suggesting a pattern.
Oh, I see.
He's saying, look, our ancestors survived the unimaginable in Babylon. They sat in the ashes and they wrestled with these exact same terrifying doubts about God's justice, but they survived.
So if God met them in their darkness, maybe God will meet us in ours.
Precisely.
Okay, that reframes it completely for me. It's not hiding at all. It's anchoring.
Yes, anchoring is the perfect word.
The historical distance allows the community to process their current radioactive grief without being totally vaporized by it. It's like they are putting on a hazmat suit of history to handle the toxic waste of their present trauma.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it.
Yeah.
Because when trauma is too raw, looking at it directly is like staring into the sun.
You'll go blind. You need a lens.
Exactly. You need a lens. And the Babylonian exile becomes the lens through which they can examine the Roman destruction. It grounds the immediate panic in a broader narrative of endurance and cyclical history.
And think about how deeply that maps onto how we process collective trauma today.
Oh, absolutely.
When our modern systems fail, or when we face massive global crises like a global pandemic and economic collapse, the outbreak of a war, we instinctively reach back for historical parallels.
We really do. I mean, during the COVID-19 pandemic, what did everyone immediately start reading about?
The 1918 flu pandemic.
Exactly. And during the 2008 financial crisis, we obsessed over the Great Depression.
We do it because framing our current pain within a historical cycle gives us footing. It reminds us that humanity has navigated the abyss before and come out the other side.
It's a vital coping mechanism, and it translates directly into a profound perspective shift for the individual today, too.
Like on a personal level.
Yeah, for you listening, when you face a catastrophic disruption in your own life, maybe your company goes bankrupt, or a 20-year marriage suddenly dissolves, or you receive a terrifying medical diagnosis, the immediate reaction is usually this feeling of unprecedented isolation.
The feeling that this has never happened before and the world is ending.
Right. The absolute singularity of grief. You feel like you are the first person to ever experience this specific pain.
But if you can apply the mechanism of two Esdras, you look for a typology.
Exactly. You ask yourself, what historical models in my own life can I draw upon to find resilience?
We all have a personal history.
We do. If you can look back at a previous trauma, you survived a previous destruction of your temple, so to speak,
Right.
You can use that past survival as a code for your current crisis.
You remind yourself, like, hey, 10 years ago, I thought my life was over when I lost that career. I sat in those ashes and I survived it. I rebuilt.
It doesn't make the current pain disappear, obviously.
Yeah, it still hurts.
but it contextualizes it. It provides that historical safety net we were talking about.
That is a massive shift in perspective. But as we dig into the actual text itself, we run into a major structural complication right at the beginning.
We really do.
Because if a listener goes and opens up a copy of 2 Esdras right now and just starts reading chapter 1, they're going to hit a wall that seems to contradict everything we just said about a traumatized Jewish author mourning Jerusalem.
The narrative voice whipsaws dramatically.
Yeah, the text is really layered.
It is. 2 Esdras is not a single unified document written in one sitting. It is a composite text heavily edited over centuries.
It's wild to think about.
And this is where the rigorous work of textual scholars, like the early 20th century scholar W.O.E. Oesterle, becomes indispensable.
Because they didn't just guess that the text was spliced together, right?
No, they looked at the mechanics of the language. They analyzed the syntax, the vocabulary, the theological preoccupations, and they noticed these massive tectonic fault lines in the book.
Specifically, chapters 1 and 2 read entirely differently from chapters 3 through 10.
It's an incredibly jarring transition.
I mean, if you read chapter 1, it opens with God speaking through Ezra, but the tone isn't mourning at all. It is furious.
Yeah, God is recounting all the ways he saved Israel, delivering them from Egypt, feeding them in the wilderness, giving them leaders.
But then he pivots and basically says, "Seeing ye have forsaken me, I will forsake you also."
He explicitly declares he is going to turn to other nations, a people from the east, who will believe without even needing to see signs.
It reads like a brutal divine breakup letter, explicitly replacing one group of people with another. It completely lacks the empathetic grief we expect from someone mourning a burned city.
And the reason for that jarring shift is because chapters 1 and 2 are not from 100 AD.
They aren't.
No, and they are not Jewish in origin. Scholars have demonstrated that these first 2 chapters are actually Christian additions from the 2nd century.
Oh.
Yeah, likely spliced onto the front of the book around 150 AD. The linguistic style breaks from the Aramaic and Hebrew thought patterns of the middle chapters and shifts into Greek syntactical structures that were common to 2nd century Christian writings.
That makes so much sense.
And more importantly, the theology perfectly maps onto the polemics of that later era, specifically the development of replacement theology.
Which is the idea that God had permanently turned his back on the Jewish people for their rejection of Jesus and had chosen a new people, the Gentile church.
Exactly.
So someone in the 2nd century took this profoundly sad, deeply Jewish survival manual about the destruction of Jerusalem and just bolted a new introduction onto it that essentially says, by the way, you deserved it and God is done with you.
It is intense. It's ideological hijacking.
And then, as soon as you hit chapter 3, the text abruptly shifts back to the year 100 AD. The true Ezra apocalypse actually begins.
Chapters 3 through 10 are the Jewish core.
Right. They are wrestling with genuine, agonizing grief over Israel's suffering and Rome's prosperity. It is no longer God rejecting Israel. It's Israel crying out to God in total confusion.
It's a completely different theological universe. Now, as we look at these texts, it's highly important to clarify our stance here as modern analysts.
No, absolutely. We have to be clear about this.
We aren't here to endorse first-century religious politics or take sides in ancient theological turf wars.
Right. We are not validating the anti-Jewish replacement theology of the 2nd century Christian editors, nor are we litigating the historical grievances of the original author against Rome.
Exactly. We are looking at this purely as a historical artifact that reveals a really deep human reality.
How traumatized communities weaponize, edit, and circulate texts to make sense of their grief, or to justify their theological positions in the wake of a tragedy.
But I will admit, this layered authorship makes me deeply uncomfortable as a modern reader.
Oh, I totally get that, because we have this romanticized idea of wisdom literature, don't we?
We really do. We want one enlightened author sitting under a fig tree, experiencing a moment of pure, uninterrupted divine download, and writing it down perfectly.
Finding out that a sacred document is basically a messy, spliced-together battleground of competing factions, it feels unstable.
It feels like finding out your favorite documentary was heavily doctored by a rival studio.
Yes. But it is uncomfortable. But that discomfort is where the actual growth happens.
Realizing that the text is messy teaches us that spiritual and historical traditions are not sterile artifacts delivered in a vacuum.
They are living, breathing arguments. They reflect the turbulent, flawed, deeply conflicted human beings who preserved them.
And the fact that different communities were fighting over the meaning of Ezra, editing him, adding chapters to his visions, it proves how incredibly vital and threatening his original questions were.
Because people don't bother heavily editing a text they don't care about.
Exactly. And if we pull back and look at how this operates today, the parallel is almost frighteningly exact.
Think about how modern media, news cycles, and historical narratives work the exact moment a crisis occurs.
Oh yeah, a tragedy happens, a systemic failure, a riot, a market crash.
Within minutes, different ideological factions begin taking the raw facts of the event and writing their own chapters 1 and 2 as an introduction to explain it.
Faction A takes the event and splices on an intro saying this is entirely the fault of this specific demographic group.
And then Faction B takes the exact same event and adds an intro saying, no, this proves that our political rivals are irredeemably corrupt.
The narrative is being continuously edited and weaponized in real time on our timelines, just like the Ezra text was edited over decades in antiquity.
Which highlights why the skill of discernment is arguably the most critical cognitive tool you can develop today.
When you consume information, especially information explaining a crisis or assigning blame, you have to ask yourself, what is the core reality here? And what are the editorial layers that have been bolted onto it?
Whose narrative is this serving? You don't necessarily have to throw the entire text or the news report into the garbage.
No, but you must learn to separate the raw human experience in Chapter 3 from the ideological polemics added in Chapter 1.
That brings us perfectly to the actual core of the text, the raw, bleeding human experience that starts in Chapter 3. Let's really dive into the profound philosophical meat of this apocalypse.
Yeah, let's do it.
So Ezra is sitting in the ruins looking at the smoke, and he presents his case to God. And I have to say, it is one of the most articulate, devastating complaints in all of ancient literature.
Ezra is basically acting as the defense attorney for humanity, and he is demanding an audit of the universe.
In Chapter 3, he looks at the ruins of Zion, Jerusalem, and then he looks at the massive, opulent wealth of Babylon, which, again, is the code for Rome.
And he asks a brilliantly simple question. He says, are the deeds of Babylon better than those of Zion?
He looks at the Roman Empire. They are incredibly violent, they worship idols, they crush the poor, they operate on sheer brutal power.
And they are thriving. Their cities are marble, their aqueducts run with fresh water, their treasuries are overflowing.
Then he looks at his own people. Yes, they were flawed, yes, they made mistakes, but they generally tried to keep God's law.
And they are enslaved, slaughtered, and their holy site is a pile of ash. The cosmic math is utterly broken.
He practically yells at God in Chapter 3, verse 33. He says, I have gone here and there through the heathen, and I see that they flow in wealth, and think not upon thy commandments. Weigh thou therefore our wickedness now in the balance, and there's also, and so shall thy name nowhere be found but in Israel.
He is literally demanding that God pull out the ledgers.
Put Rome on one side of the scale, put us on the other, and explain to me how they get the marble palaces and we get the mass graves.
He wants the cosmic why.
And God's response to this demand is breathtaking.
God doesn't speak directly, right? He sends the archangel Uriel.
Now, typically in ancient philosophy, when someone raises the problem of evil, you expect a long, complex philosophical defense.
You expect a lecture on human free will, or the necessity of suffering for soul-making, or promise of future retribution.
But Uriel gives none of that.
None. Instead, Uriel shows up in Chapter 4 and issues Ezra 3 completely impossible, almost absurd challenges.
He says to Ezra, go thy way. Weigh me the weight of the fire, or measure me the blast of the wind, or call me again the day that is past.
Weigh the fire, measure the wind, bring back yesterday.
It's incredibly poetic, but it's also a brutal intellectual shutdown.
Ezra obviously stammers out. What man is able to do that? He can't put fire on a scale. He can't catch the wind in a measuring cup.
And that admission is the trap Uriel was setting.
Once Ezra admits he cannot do these basic things, Uriel delivers the hammer blow.
He essentially says, fire, wind, and time are the basic elements of the world you live in every single day. If you cannot understand or measure the things you grew up with, how can your finite, limited vessel possibly comprehend the way of the highest?
How can you possibly audit the architecture of cosmic justice?
I want to make sure we don't misinterpret this, because on the surface, it sounds like Uriel's just saying, shut up, God is big and you are small. It sounds kind of dismissive.
It's not dismissive at all. It is structural. Uriel is pointing out a fundamental, inescapable mismatch between human cognitive capacity and the reality of the universe.
Ezra is trying to fit the infinite, multidimensional complexity of cosmic justice into the tiny, linear, finite box of human logic.
Uriel isn't saying Ezra's pain is invalid. He is saying that the mechanism of the universe operates on a level of reality that is literally inaccessible to our human sensory and cognitive apparatus.
Okay, let me try an analogy here to see if I grasp the mechanics of this.
Go for it.
It's like trying to download a terabyte of incredibly complex data, say, the entire rendering of a massive modern video game using a 1990s 56K dial-up modem.
Oh, that's good.
Your hardware literally cannot process the information. If you try to force it, you don't get the game, your system just crashes. You sit there watching the progress bar say 99 years remaining, the screen freezes, and you get incredibly frustrated.
But the problem isn't that the data is bad or doesn't exist.
Right. The problem is that your hardware lacks the bandwidth to receive it. Ezra's mind is crashing because he's trying to download the cosmic why.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Ezra's modem is smoking because he's trying to process variables that are outside of human time and space.
And if we translate that to modern times, Uriel's answer is a direct, devastating challenge to the fundamental hubris of our current era.
Because we live in the information age.
The underlying assumption of modern life is that every single problem is solvable with enough data.
We genuinely believe that if we just get enough analytics, read enough think pieces, sequence enough DNA, or build a powerful enough artificial intelligence, we can perfectly map out the reason behind every tragedy.
Every market crash, every geopolitical failure, every illness, we are totally addicted to the why.
When something terrible happens, we endlessly scroll the news, looking for the one article that will make the senseless tragedy make sense. We think certainty is a human right.
Exactly. But Uriel challenges that modern arrogance. He reminds us that there are variables in the architecture of reality that we simply cannot measure or weigh.
The universe is not obligated to make sense to our specific, localized mammalian brains.
Think about how this applies to you today on a personal level. When you face a sudden, inexplicable hardship, say, you work tirelessly for a promotion for 5 years, you do everything right, and they give it to the guy who sleeps at his desk and steals your ideas.
Or, far worse, a healthy loved one suddenly gets terminally ill.
We obsessively try to calculate the why. We run the ledgers, just like Ezra. I ate healthy. I was kind. Why did this happen?
And trying to answer that impossible why usually leads to deep bitterness or complete psychological breakdown.
But if we adopt Ezra's weighing the fire concept, it shifts everything. We realize we are trying to process cosmic geometry with a pocket calculator.
Releasing the demand for an immediate answer isn't giving up. It isn't defeatism.
It's just recognizing the limits of our own hardware. It is the deep, profound humility of saying, I lack the bandwidth to understand the totality of this event, and therefore I give myself permission to stop agonizing over the math.
That is the relief of acknowledging your own limits. But of course, the human mind doesn't surrender easily.
No, Ezra is a bulldog.
He absorbs Uriel's point about his limited hardware, but he pivots. He essentially says, okay, maybe I can't understand the vast cosmic ledger, but I still have to live in this world.
And this world feels actively, intentionally hostile. Where did this hostility come from in the first place? And where is it all heading?
Right. If we can't understand the universe, how are we supposed to navigate a world that is so broken?
Which launches us into the terrifying apocalyptic visions in chapters 5 and 6. Ezra asks about the signs of the end of the age, and Uriel gives him imagery that is straight out of a psychological horror film.
It really is.
He talks about blood dropping from wood, stones speaking, the sun shining in the middle of the night, salt waters found in sweet springs, wild beasts wandering out of their zones, and women giving birth to monsters. It is incredibly visceral.
It is deeply unsettling imagery, but it's important to understand how apocalyptic literature actually functions.
It's not necessarily meant to be read as a literal weather forecast for the end of the world, right?
No, it is the language of ontological unraveling.
Right.
When blood drips from wood and the sun shines at night, the basic foundational laws of nature are breaking down. Categories are collapsing.
The author is expressing the profound psychological feeling that the moral and physical universe is disintegrating. Chaos is uncreating the cosmos.
It's the ancient equivalent of feeling like the simulation is glitching.
But Ezra isn't satisfied just knowing that things will fall apart. He wants the root cause. He goes on a deep philosophical dig into the origin of human wickedness.
Why are we like this? Why is it so easy for humans to build a Roman Empire that tortures people, and so hard to build a society of justice?
And he arrives at a very specific foundational diagnosis in chapter 4, verse 30. He identifies what he calls the grain of evil seed.
The text says, "For the grain of evil seed hath been sown in the heart of Adam from the beginning, and how much ungodliness hath it brought up unto this time."
Ezra goes on to argue that God gave humans the law, but didn't take away the wicked heart, so the infirmity became permanent. The good departed away, and the evil abode still.
He traces the entire geopolitical nightmare of Rome burning Jerusalem all the way back to the psychological DNA of the very first human.
He says in chapter 7, "O thou Adam, what hast thou done? For though it was thou that sinned, thou art not fallen alone, but we all that come of thee."
He is arguing that corruption isn't just a matter of a few bad geopolitical choices or corrupt politicians. It is an inherited, permanent root condition of the human species.
This is an incredibly profound exploration of the nature of evil. And we need to pause here because this specific idea is a massive friction point for modern listeners.
Oh, this concept is highly countercultural today.
If we look at modern thought, especially the dominant philosophies that emerged since the Enlightenment, think of thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the prevailing idea is that human beings are inherently good, or at the very least, we are born as a neutral blank slate.
Yeah, the modern assumption is that if a person does something terrible, it's because society failed them.
It's bad parenting or systemic inequality or poor education or lack of resources.
The logic is, if we can just fix the environment, if we just build the perfect utopian system, human beings will naturally revert to being good, kind, and peaceful.
We believe evil is external, like an infection we catch from a bad environment. But 2 Esdras argues the exact opposite.
It argues that the corruption is internal, permanent, and inherited. The grain of evil seed is baked into our operational code.
My initial reaction to that is resistance. It feels so dark, so pessimistic, so defeatist.
It really does sound that way at first.
If we are fundamentally corrupted at the root, what is the point of even trying to build a better world or be a better person? Why not just give up?
It feels defeatist until you realize the tremendous psychological relief hidden within this perspective. Let's look at the alternative.
Okay.
If you truly believe that humans are naturally, effortlessly good, then what happens when you experience your own darkness? Every time you fail, every time you feel a surge of intense selfishness, every time you act out of malice or jealousy, you feel like a monstrous outlier.
You think something is uniquely, horribly wrong with me. I am broken.
You carry an immense burden of shame.
Oh, wow. I see where you were going. If the default state is supposed to be perfect goodness, any deviation is a catastrophic failure.
Yes, but 2 Esdras completely removes that specific shame by validating the sheer difficulty of virtue.
It acknowledges that doing the right thing is an uphill, grueling battle against our own internal nature.
It normalizes the moral struggle. It says, of course it is hard for you to be kind when you want to be cruel. Of course it is hard to be generous when you are afraid. You have a grain of evil seed you're fighting against.
It means you aren't a unique monster when you struggle. You are simply human, engaged in the universal war of the soul.
It's almost a relief to hear that, isn't it?
It completely flips the script. Virtue isn't our resting state, it's a massive achievement. And Uriel gives a really powerful physical metaphor to explain this required struggle in chapter 7.
The metaphor of the narrow path.
Yes, it's one of the most striking images in the book. Uriel asks Ezra to imagine a beautiful city built on a broad plain full of all good things, wealth, peace, immortality.
But the entrance to this city is set in a terrifyingly dangerous place. There is a blazing fire on the right hand and deep freezing water on the left.
And there's only one narrow path between them, a bridge so small that only one person can carefully walk across it at a time.
Uriel asks, if a man is given this city as an inheritance, how can he ever receive it unless he passes through the danger?
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here, because if I am Ezra, I am immediately asking why the fire and the water?
Why make it so hard?
Does this mean God intentionally designed life to be a miserable, terrifying obstacle course? Why build the beautiful city behind a deadly trap?
Ezra essentially raises that exact objection. But Uriel's response connects right back to the grain of evil seed. Uriel explains that this narrowness was decreed when Adam transgressed.
The text explicitly says that the entrances of the elder world were wide and sure and brought immortal fruit.
The original design of reality, the Edenic state, was safe, wide, and easily accessible.
So God didn't originally build the obstacle course.
Correct. But because of the introduction of the evil seed, the fundamental architecture of reality changed.
The path to meaning, virtue, and inheritance now requires navigating extreme peril.
You cannot access the city of good things without braving the fire and the water because the environment has been fundamentally compromised by human failure.
The psychological translation of this for us today is incredibly practical. It's entirely about expectation setting.
Exactly, expectation setting.
For anyone listening, think about the hardest things you are doing in your life right now. Maybe you are trying to build a business from scratch, or you are trying to save a failing marriage, or you are doing the grueling daily work of overcoming an addiction.
Are you exhausted and frustrated because you secretly believe it should be easy? Are you expecting a wide, safe passage to a good life?
Most of our suffering comes from the gap between our expectations and reality. We expect the wide path.
We really do.
Yeah.
But if you accept the premise of 2 Esdras, that the inherent, unavoidable difficulty of a worthy goal is baked into the universe, it fundamentally changes your approach.
If you know ahead of time that the fire and the water are standard features of the path, you stop panicking when you feel the heat.
You don't quit when you get wet. You say, here's the fire I was told about. This means I'm on the right path. You just keep walking.
It shifts your internal monologue from, why is this terrible thing happening to me, something must be wrong, to, this is the required terrain for the destination I seek. This is the cost of entry.
It builds incredible resilience.
But Ezra's resilience is wearing dangerously thin. As he contemplates this narrow path and he thinks about the grain of evil seed deeply rooted in every human heart, he does the math again.
And this time, the math sends him into absolute existential despair.
This leads us to the darkest part of the text, the theodicy of the few.
In chapter 7 and 8, Ezra reaches the absolute bottom. He realizes that if the path to the city is a tightrope between fire and water, and if the human heart is naturally weighed down by an inherited evil seed, then almost no one is going to make it.
He looks at the terrifying ratio of suffering to salvation, and he realizes that the vast majority of humanity is going to perish.
He reaches a point of such devastation that he questions the very value of creation itself.
His words here are haunting. He says in chapter 7, this is my first and last saying, that it had been better not to have given the earth unto Adam, or else, when it was given him, to have restrained him from sinning.
For what profit is it for men now in this present time to live in heaviness, and after death to look for punishment?
He is essentially telling God, you should have aborted the human project. The cost is too high. If the vast majority of conscious beings are just going to suffer and die, then existing is worse than not existing.
It is the ultimate expression of nihilistic dread. Ezra concludes that humanity is a failed experiment.
And God's response, delivered again through Uriel, is famously austere. It offers no comfort, only cold cosmic reality.
In chapter 8, Uriel says, "The Most High hath made this world for many, but the world to come for few."
The world to come for few. That is chilling.
Uriel uses an analogy from nature to illustrate this. He tells Ezra to go ask the earth how it produces materials.
The earth will tell you that it yields absolutely massive amounts of clay, enough to make millions of common earthen vessels, plates, and pots.
But it yields very, very little dust that produces gold. Uriel's point is blunt: there be many created, but few shall be saved. Humanity is mostly clay. Gold is a statistical anomaly.
Gold versus clay. Let's apply some careful discernment here, because this severity, this extreme exclusivity, the idea that 99% of humanity is just cheap, disposable pottery destined for the cosmic trash heap, is an incredibly harsh ancient worldview.
It borders on fatalistic predestination.
It is exceptionally harsh. And as modern readers, we do not have to adopt this extreme theological exclusivity or the literal damnation of the masses to glean the wisdom embedded within the metaphor.
Right. If we abstract the core principle, what Uriel's really describing is the absolute rarity of true virtue, excellence, and unshakable integrity in the human experience.
Okay, that makes sense. If you look at human history, or even just look at a daily news feed, the default state of human behavior, the clay, is often chaos, selfishness, mediocrity, and tribal violence.
True. Self-sacrificing wisdom is incredibly rare.
Exactly. So instead of mourning the sheer abundance of clay, instead of being constantly shocked and paralyzed by the fact that the world is full of selfish or cruel behavior, we have to focus our finite energy on cultivating the gold within ourselves and our immediate sphere of influence.
Yeah. But I want to highlight something absolutely incredible about Ezra's character in this moment.
What's that?
Even when an angel directly tells him, "This is just the way the universe works, Ezra. Clay is common, gold is rare. Stop worrying about the universe." Ezra refuses to accept it.
He doesn't just nod, pat himself on the back, and say, well, I'm glad I'm one of the few pieces of gold.
No. He argues back. He advocates for the clay.
He does. He uses another agricultural metaphor. He says to God, look, a farmer plants seeds. If the seeds don't get rain, or if they get too much rain, they perish. But man is not just a plant. Man is formed by your own hands in your image. How can you just let the seeds you planted perish so casually?
He is caught in this massive tension between cosmic justice, God's top-down systemic perspective of the universe, and human compassion.
Ezra feels the pain of the perishing seeds in his own physical body. He says, for whose sake I am sorry, for whom I am heavy. It's profound empathy.
It is a beautiful display of empathy, but it's also destroying him. And this tension connects very deeply to broader philosophical frameworks, particularly Stoic thought and modern cognitive psychology.
Because Ezra is trying to carry the weight of the entire world's salvation on his own shoulders.
He is grieving for everyone who has ever lived and failed. The wisdom Uriel is trying to impart, albeit harshly, is that Ezra is violating the fundamental dichotomy of control.
Unpack that a bit. How does the dichotomy of control apply here?
In Stoicism, the core practice is differentiating between what is within your direct control and what is outside of it.
You can only walk your own narrow path. You can only fight the evil seed within your own heart. You can only cultivate the gold in your own soul.
You absolutely cannot control the macro fate of the broader chaotic world. Taking on the existential dread of the entire human race will paralyze you.
It makes you entirely useless to the people around you who actually need your help.
That perfectly sets the stage for the absolute climax of this section of the text.
Ezra is paralyzed. He has been arguing in circles with the angel about the many and the few, the fire and the water, the gold and the clay.
He is trapped in an intellectual loop of inescapable grief. Logic has failed to comfort him.
So God changes tactics entirely. God gives him an experiential vision instead of a philosophical argument.
This brings us to the stunning events in chapters 9 and 10. Ezra is commanded to go into a specific field where no house has ever been built, a field called Ardath.
He is sitting there among the wildflowers, still vexed in his heart, still running the cosmic ledgers, still complaining to God about the fate of the many.
And suddenly, he looks to his right and he sees a woman.
And this woman is the picture of absolute misery. She is in torn clothes, she has ashes poured over her head, and she is weeping loudly, grieving with a broken heart.
Now remember, Ezra has just spent chapters crying, begging God to have compassion on suffering humanity. He is the champion of empathy.
So he sees this poor, weeping woman in a field, and he attacks her. He gets angry and rebukes her.
He asks what's wrong, and she tells him a devastating personal story. She says she was barren for 30 years. She prayed endlessly. Finally, God gave her a son.
She raised him with great labor and love.
But on the very day he entered his wedding chamber, the day he became a man, he fell down and died. Her entire life's purpose was erased in a second.
So she has fled the city to this empty field, resolved to sit there, fast, and mourn until she starves to death.
And Ezra's response is shocking. He calls her a foolish woman.
He essentially yells at her, "How dare you mourn for one son, when Sion, our mother, is completely laid waste. Our sanctuary is destroyed, our priests are burnt, our virgins are defiled."
The whole earth is mourning the collapse of the universe, and you are sitting here crying over one son. Keep your sorrow to yourself.
It is so out of character. Why does he lash out like this?
To understand why he lashes out, we have to look at the psychological mechanism of projection.
Projection. Okay.
Why do humans, when they are overwhelmed by a massive systemic trauma, often snap at people over incredibly minor things?
Imagine a modern scenario. You just got laid off, your spouse asked for a divorce, your life is in ruins. You walk into a coffee shop and a guy in front of you drops his coffee and starts crying.
You are highly likely to yell at that guy. Why? Because the macro grief of your entire life collapsing is too large, too abstract, and too terrifying to process.
So your brain projects all of that rage onto a micro grief that you can easily identify and control.
That makes total sense. Ezra's macro grief is the destruction of Jerusalem. The woman's micro grief is her son.
Ezra's yelling at her, telling her to get over it, but he is really yelling at himself. He is externalizing his own internal paralysis.
Exactly. And then the twist happens.
While he is lecturing her, demanding that she shake off her grief and look at the bigger picture, her face suddenly begins to shine with brilliant, glistering light.
She lets out a fearful, earth-shattering cry. The ground shakes violently.
And in an instant, the woman vanishes entirely. In her place, Ezra sees a massive, beautiful, brilliantly constructed city rising from the foundations.
He is terrified and screams for Uriel to explain what is happening.
Uriel appears and gives the interpretation that changes the entire meaning of the book.
He says to Ezra, "The woman you saw is Sion, Jerusalem. The 30 years of barrenness represent the 3,000 years before Solomon built the temple and offered sacrifices.
The son she finally bore was the temple and the earthly city of Jerusalem."
And the son dying on his wedding day. That was the destruction of Jerusalem that you are currently mourning.
It is a breathtaking revelation. Ezra thought he was talking to a random woman grieving a random son, but God had placed a mirror in the field.
He was literally lecturing the physical manifestation of his own grief.
He was so trapped in his intellectual loop of despair that he couldn't see his own reflection.
He arrogantly told the woman to zoom out, to stop hyper-focusing on her dead son, and look at the bigger picture, completely unaware that God was using his own words to diagnose his exact spiritual sickness.
Precisely. And the crux of the vision is the transfiguration. The weeping woman transforms into the magnificent heavenly city.
Uriel explains that because Ezra sorrowed unfeignedly from his whole heart for Sion, God showed him the brightness of her eternal glory.
The theological and psychological teaching here is profound. Hyper-focusing on our immediate material loss, the death of the earthly son. The destruction of the earthly city blinds us to the enduring, unshakable realities that exist on a higher plane.
The earthly Jerusalem, made of stone and wood, was destroyed. But the heavenly Jerusalem, the eternal concept of God's dwelling with humanity, remains untouched and glorious.
Let's translate that mechanism for you listening today, because this is the ultimate perspective shift.
When we experience a catastrophic loss in our lives, we are the weeping woman in the field.
We want to put ashes on our head, sit in the dirt, and let our grief consume us until we starve. We fixate entirely on the son that died, the business that went bankrupt, the relationship that ended, the health that deteriorated.
That material loss becomes our entire universe. The micro-grief blocks out the horizon.
So the practice here is to apply Ezra's own advice to ourselves. When you are overwhelmed by a specific, paralyzing loss, you have to actively force yourself to zoom out.
Acknowledge the shared universal suffering of humanity. But more importantly, you must look for the transfiguration.
You must look for the shining face of the new foundations being laid in the wake of your destruction.
Often, the violent collapse of our immediate, comfortable material reality is simply the clearing of the field.
It is the necessary demolition required for a much larger, more enduring city to be built in our lives. A city constructed out of resilience, deeper empathy, refined character, and ultimate meaning.
The grief isn't invalidated. The tears are real. But the grief is transformed. You realize the end of the earthly city is just the beginning of the heavenly one.
That is incredibly powerful. The destruction is a clearing of the field. And as we wrap up this deep dive into 2 Esdras, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought that ties all of this together.
Back in chapter 4, when Ezra is demanding to know when the suffering will end and when the reward of the righteous will finally arrive, Uriel gives him an unforgettable metaphor.
He compares the souls waiting in the heavenly chambers to a pregnant woman in the final stages of labor.
He says, like, as a woman that travaileth maketh haste to escape the necessity of the travail, even so do these places haste to deliver those things that are committed unto them.
It's a striking, visceral image. The universe is pressing forward like a child desperate to be born.
Right. Think about the intensity of labor. It is agonizing. It is chaotic. It feels like the body is tearing itself apart.
Just as a woman in labor makes haste to deliver so the pain will finally end, the universe is making haste to deliver the future.
The pain, the chaos, the confusion, the narrow, terrifying path between the fire and the water that you are experiencing right now, it might not just be meaningless suffering.
It might not be a sign that the world is a broken, nihilistic tragedy. It might be later pains.
The crushing pressure you feel in your life right now might actually be the labor pains of a new, transfigured reality violently trying to be born.
That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.